Hey guys, tonight we're diving into a history so profoundly unexciting, so utterly mundane. It promises to be the perfect lullaby. We're going back, way, way back, to a time before TikTok dances, and even before the wheel. Imagine, if you will, the gentle whisper of wind through nascent grain fields, the rhythmic thud-thud of a stone grinding against another, turning coarse wild cereals into something vaguely edible. You're there, really there, feeling the grit of ancient soil between your toes, smelling the earthy scent of a freshly tilled patch, the faint, almost imperceptible aroma of, well, future cabbage. You're living a life where the biggest excitement might be finding a particularly plump wild turnip, or perhaps a well-formed flint tool that doesn't immediately shatter. This is a world where survival isn't just a concept, it's your full-time job, and every sunrise brings with it the daunting prospect of another day of backbreaking labor just to keep your tiny, vulnerable community alive. You probably won't survive this, not if you were actually there, but luckily, you're here with me, safe and sound. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're a Neolithic farmer, perhaps somewhere in the Fertile Crescent, maybe even a little further west, in Anatolia. The sun is just peeking over the horizon, painting the sky in soft oranges and purples, but you're not admiring the view. Oh no, you're already up, stretching out the kinks from a night spent on a hard-packed earth floor. Your muscles ache from yesterday's toil, the constant stooping, the heavy lifting of stones to clear a new patch of ground. Your hands, calloused and rough, are a testament to a life lived in constant physical engagement with the land. You rub the sleep from your eyes, and the first thing you see isn't the face of a loved one, but the nascent green shoots of your field. These aren't vast, sprawling monocultures like you'd see today. These are small, often irregular plots, carved out of the wilderness with immense effort. Each seed planted is a gamble, a desperate hope for sustenance. Life is a relentless cycle of planting, tending, and hoping. You understand, on a visceral level, that your very existence hinges on the success of these crops. There's no supermarket, no delivery service, no friendly neighbor with a spare bag of flour if yours runs out. There's just you, your family, and the collective effort of your small community against the vast and different forces of nature. The rhythm of your days is dictated by the seasons, by the sun, by the unpredictable rains. You watch the sky with an intensity modern meteorologists could only dream of. A cloudy day isn't just a cloudy day. It's a potential lifesaver, promising much-needed moisture, or a harbinger of destructive storms. The crops you're tending are, by today's standards, pretty meager. Wild einkorn, emmer wheat, barley, these are the staples, tough and resilient, but yielding far less than their modern descendants. You're also experimenting, always experimenting, with other wild plants. You've noticed that some leafy greens, the kind you usually just forage for, seem to grow a bit better if you clear the ground around them, give them a little more sunlight. You might even toss a few of their seeds into a designated spot, just to see what happens. This slow, painstaking process of observation and trial and error is the very bedrock of agriculture, laying the foundation for all the food systems that followed. You're not thinking about agricultural revolutions. You're just trying to get enough to eat. Your diet is, frankly, boring. Grains, some foraged berries, maybe a bit of lean wild game if the hunters are lucky, and those ever-present leafy greens. The concept of variety is a luxury you can barely fathom. Every meal is a practical necessity, a refuel for another day of strenuous activity. You dream of a successful harvest, not of a gourmet feast. And the thought of a boring history podcast would be utterly alien to you. Your history is being written minute by minute in sweat and soil, in the quiet struggle to simply exist. Historians still argue whether early farmers consciously understood the genetic principles of selective breeding or if it was a more intuitive, accidental process over generations. Whatever the case, you're contributing to it, one hand-planted seed at a time. It's a simple, brutal, and profoundly impactful existence, laying the groundwork for everything that came after. As you continue your laborious day, your attention often drifts to the wild plants growing just beyond your carefully tended patch. Among them, scraggly, tough-looking specimens of Brassica oleracea grow haphazardly. To you, it's just another bitter, leafy green, something you might gather if other forage is scarce, a last resort when the grains are lean. It's certainly not something you'd lavish much attention upon. This is the wild ancestor of what we now casually refer to as cabbage, broccoli, kale, cauliflower, and a whole host of other seemingly distinct vegetables. Imagine that. From this one, unpretentious, slightly bitter coastal plant sprang forth a botanical dynasty. It's almost like discovering that your grumpy, unkempt neighbor is actually the progenitor of all modern celebrities. You probably wouldn't believe it. This wild Brassica oleracea clung to life on cliffs and rocky coasts, primarily around the Mediterranean and Atlantic Europe. It was a survivor, hardy and tolerant of salty air and poor soil. Its leaves were, to put it mildly, not particularly appetizing. They were tough, fibrous, and packed with glucosinolates, compounds that give them that characteristic pungent, slightly bitter flavor. This bitterness, while off-putting to us, was likely a natural defense mechanism against hungry herbivores, including early humans. You wouldn't be thinking, "Oh, this is delicious." Instead, you'd be thinking, "Well, it's green and I'm starving, so here goes nothing." The history of this plant is, frankly, one of the least glamorous stories in the botanical world. There's no dramatic evolutionary leap, no sudden burst of vibrant color, or irresistible aroma. It's a tale of slow, incremental changes, guided by generations of unconscious human selection. For millennia, it remained a wild food source, a bit player in the human diet. It wasn't majestic like a wild boar, nor was it a reliable staple like wild wheat. It was just there. Yet, its humble origins belie its monumental impact. This plant, which you might carelessly trample today, would eventually become one of the most important domesticated food crops in human history, feeding empires and enduring famines. You wouldn't suspect it now, but you're looking at the botanical equivalent of a caterpillar before it becomes a butterfly. Except the butterfly is still pretty green and just tastes a bit different. The wild cabbage of your time wasn't cultivated in any meaningful sense. You'd know its leaves could be boiled to soften them, perhaps mixed with other foraged greens to dilute the bitterness. Maybe you'd learned from your ancestors that certain parts were less acrid than others. You might even have noticed that some individual plants seemed to have slightly larger or less bitter leaves than their neighbors. But these would be casual observations, not the systematic study of a botanist. The concept of breeding for desirable traits is still eons away, a faint whisper in the wind that you couldn't possibly comprehend. This raw, undomesticated form of cabbage represents a crucial moment in human-plant interaction. It's the very beginning of a relationship that would transform both species. For the plant, it meant moving from rugged coastal cliffs to carefully prepared garden plots, a trade-off of wild freedom for guaranteed survival and propagation. For humans, it meant a more reliable, if still humble, source of nutrition. Historians still argue whether the initial interaction was purely utilitarian, driven by immediate hunger, or if there was an early, nascent curiosity about plant properties that contributed to its eventual domestication. You, however, are just trying to get through the day, one slightly bitter leaf at a time. The quiet, consistent presence of this wild plant, a mere background detail in your arduous life, was in fact the preface to an agricultural revolution, a gentle green precursor to a future where food production would become the bedrock of civilizations. Your hands, rough and stained with earth, are reaching not for a gleaming smartphone, but for a sharpened digging stick. This simple tool, Perhaps just a sturdy branch with a fire-hardened tip is your primary instrument of change. You're not just gathering food anymore. You're actively interfering with nature, gently coaxing it to yield more. This is the very genesis of domestication, a monumental shift in human history, born not from grand theories, but from thousands of tiny, repetitive actions just like yours. You've noticed, over countless seasons, that some wild patches consistently produce more than others. Perhaps the soil is richer, or water collects there after a rain, or maybe it's just naturally sheltered from the harshest winds. You begin to favor these spots. Instead of just picking what's available, you might clear away competing weeds, giving your preferred plants more room to breathe, more sunlight to soak up. This isn't farming as we know it, not with neat rows and cultivated fields, but it's a crucial precursor. It's the moment you stop being a passive gatherer and become an active manager of your food supply. Consider those wild brassica plants. You've noticed that if you snap off the tougher, outer leaves, the inner ones might grow a little larger, a little less bitter. Perhaps you've observed that plants growing closer to a water source are plumper. So, you start to make conscious, albeit rudimentary, choices. You might scatter seeds from the most promising plants near your temporary shelters, hoping they'll sprout closer to hand, saving you long foraging trips. You might even dig up a small, particularly robust plant and replant it closer to where you sleep, just to see if it survives. This is rudimentary transplantation, a gamble, but one driven by the undeniable hunger in your belly. These aren't sophisticated experiments, nor are they conducted with a clear long-term vision. They are pragmatic, immediate responses to the daily challenge of survival. Each choice, each tiny intervention, is a step away from pure hunter-gathering and a step towards an agrarian lifestyle. You're not thinking about future generations or complex agricultural systems. You're just trying to make tomorrow a little easier than today. The cumulative effect of these small, desperate experiments, however, would be profound. It would lead to plants gradually becoming more reliant on human intervention, losing their wild toughness in favor of traits more appealing to the human palate. The process of domestication is a slow dance between humans and plants. You're selecting, unknowingly, for traits like larger seeds, less bitterness, easier harvesting, and a shorter growing season. Plants, in turn, are selecting for humans who will propagate them, clear their competition, and ensure their survival. It's a mutually beneficial, if often unconscious, relationship. This co-evolutionary dance is happening all around you, from the grains you painstakingly winnow to the very first attempts at taming those wild bitter leaves. One quirky tidbit. Some scholars suggest that the initial domestication of certain plants might have been driven not just by food needs, but by the desire for materials for baskets, ropes, or even dyes. Imagine that. Your primary food source might have started as a useful fiber plant, with its edible parts discovered almost as an afterthought. Historians still argue whether initial agricultural practices were driven primarily by increasing population pressure or by a deeper understanding of plant life cycles and deliberate experimentation. Regardless, your daily actions are writing the very first chapters of that story, one hesitant seed at a time. You're becoming a farmer, not by choice, but by necessity, and the wild world around you is slowly, imperceptibly, beginning to bend to your will. Now, fast forward a few more generations, or perhaps even a few centuries. The changes are glacial, almost imperceptible within a single lifetime, but cumulative. You're no longer just scattering seeds haphazardly. You've learned the rhythms of the land, the best times to plant, when to expect the rains. Your community has started to settle down, building more permanent structures, perhaps even the beginnings of small proto-villages. And those wild brassica plants, they're no longer just a desperate last resort. They've begun their slow, remarkable transformation into something you might actually want to eat. This is where the great cabbage debate truly begins, not with shouting, but with subtle preferences and practical considerations. Imagine the scene. You're gathered with your small group around a crackling fire. the smoke curling up into the crisp evening air. Someone has brought a handful of boiled greens to share. These greens, while still a far cry from the crisp, mild cabbage you know today, are a little less bitter, a little softer than their truly wild counterparts. Perhaps someone, an elder with a keen eye, points out, this one, gesturing to a particular leaf, comes from the plant near the big rock. Its leaves are thicker. Another might retort, yes, but the one by the stream has a sweeter taste, even if it's smaller. These aren't philosophical debates. They're intensely practical ones, driven by the desire for more food, better food, and food that requires less effort to prepare. You're trying to figure out which of these slightly less wild brassica plants is worth your precious time and energy to cultivate. Is it the one that yields larger leaves, even if they're still quite bitter? Or the one with smaller but sweeter leaves? Perhaps the one that grows faster, or the one that seems more resistant to the little grubs that plague your nascent gardens. Every decision, however minor, has a direct impact on your family's survival and your community's well-being. This is the point where human intention starts to actively shape the evolutionary path of a plant. You're not just choosing which leaves to eat, you're implicitly choosing which plants will reproduce. The seeds from the good plants, the ones that are less bitter, larger, or more productive, are the ones you're more likely to save and plant next season. The seeds from the bad ones, they're eaten, discarded, or simply left to struggle in the wild. This unintentional selective breeding is the cornerstone of all crop domestication. You're acting as a very early, very unscientific geneticist, guiding the plant towards forms more palatable and useful to you. One quirky tidbit: some early cabbages might have been primarily harvested for their oily seeds rather than their leaves, with the leafy greens only becoming a primary target much later in their domestication journey. Imagine arguing over the oil content of a tiny seed rather than the crispness of a leaf. Historians still argue whether the initial selection criteria for early cultivated plants were primarily focused on yield, taste, or ease of harvest and storage. Whatever the primary driver, your choices are shaping the future of food. These early debates, quiet and low stakes as they might seem, are foundational. They are the first whispers of agricultural specialization, the first steps towards understanding that not all plants of the same species are equal. You are, in essence, laying the groundwork for plant breeding, for horticulture, for the entire science of agriculture. You're learning, through direct experience, which traits are desirable and how to encourage them. The sheer patience required, the willingness to observe and experiment over countless seasons, is truly remarkable. You are literally growing your future, one slightly improved cabbage leaf at a time. The seeds, those tiny, unassuming kernels of future life, are now more than just a source of food. They're also the genesis of your first arguments. You're kneeling in the rich, dark soil, carefully pressing a few precious seeds into the earth. But this isn't just any soil. This is your soil, or at least the patch you've spent countless hours clearing of rocks and weeds, enriching with whatever meager organic matter you can find. And the seeds you're planting? They're the ones you painstakingly saved from the best plants of last season, the ones that promise slightly larger leaves, or perhaps a hint less bitterness. This small, vital act of planting is fraught with unspoken tension. You glance over at your neighbor's plot, just a few paces away. They're planting too, maybe a bit too close to your carefully defined boundary. Or perhaps their seeds look a little different. Are they trying to sneak in a less desirable variety? One that might cross-pollinate with your superior stock? The very concept of pure seed lines is embryonic, but the underlying anxiety is very real. You've invested time, effort, and hope into these tiny seeds, and any perceived threat to their success feels deeply personal. These aren't grand philosophical disagreements. These are the petty, everyday squabbles that arise when resources are scarce and survival is paramount. Imagine two early farmers grunting at each other over a handful of seeds. These are my good seeds, one might insist, clutching a small pouch. Yours are questionable? The other might retort, questionable? They're from the plant I cultivated by the sunny rock. They're clearly superior. It's less about polite discussion and more about raw assertion, backed by the undeniable weight of personal investment. The very act of saving seeds, selecting them from the best plants, introduces a new layer of complexity. If you've spent a season nurturing a particularly fine patch of wild cabbage, carefully weeding around it, perhaps even bringing water to it during a dry spell, you're going to feel a strong sense of ownership over its progeny. But what if your neighbor, seeing your success, tries to get their hands on your seeds? Or worse, what if they claim that the fertile patch you're cultivating was traditionally their family's foraging ground? These are the fundamental tensions that arise when hunter-gatherer mobility gives way to settled agricultural life. The concept of property, in its most rudimentary form, is being born, and with it, the potential for conflict. One quirky tidbit about this era: some archaeological evidence suggests that early seed-saving practices might have involved burying seeds in specially prepared pits, not just for storage, but also potentially as a form of ritualistic protection, ensuring a good harvest through supernatural means. Imagine arguing over whose ancestors' spirits would best protect a specific seed cache. Historians still argue whether early agricultural societies developed concepts of private property out of necessity for land management, or if it evolved more organically from notions of individual labor investment. Whatever the origin, these early seeds of discontent, so to speak, are already taking root. The disputes over seeds, over the best plots, over who has the right to cultivate what, are the invisible threads that will eventually weave into complex social structures and, eventually, legal systems. You're not just planting seeds. You're planting the very first arguments over resources, the earliest forms of property disputes. It's a quiet, fundamental shift where the abundance of nature is slowly being replaced by the scarcity of cultivated land, and where human ingenuity is inadvertently creating new sources of friction. The sun climbs higher, beating down on your shoulders as you meticulously prepare your patch. But the heat isn't the only source of irritation today. You feel the familiar prickle of unease as you survey the boundaries of your nascent field. The land you've cleared, painstakingly removing stubborn rocks and digging out persistent roots, represents an immense investment of your precious time and energy. This isn't just anonymous wilderness anymore. It's your wilderness, transformed by your labor into a place of potential sustenance. And this transformation, this newfound sense of ownership, is breeding entirely new forms of conflict. Imagine the simmering resentment when you discover your neighbor, a well-meaning but perhaps overly opportunistic individual, has subtly shifted a marker stone overnight, encroaching just a little further into what you consider your prime growing space. It's a tiny shift, perhaps only a handspan, but it's enough. That extra bit of sun-drenched soil, that fraction of a degree more slope for drainage, could make all the difference in the success of your meager cabbage crop. This isn't abstract legal theory. This is about your next meal, your family's survival. The most fertile plots, often those near a reliable water source, or on a gentle south-facing slope, become objects of quiet contention. You've noticed that the wild brassica you've been nurturing, which is slowly morphing into something more manageable, thrives particularly well in certain damp, loamy areas. So, when a neighboring family begins to clear ground uncomfortably close to your preferred water access point, or when they eye the very patch you'd earmarked for expansion, the tension is palpable. Words are few, but the glances are sharp, the body language stiff. It's the original land grab, played out on the smallest possible scale, but with stakes as high as life itself. These aren't just disputes over a few square meters of dirt. They're about access to the very lifeblood of your agricultural existence, water. A good water source means the difference between a thriving crop and parched, dying plants. If your neighbor diverts a small stream, even inadvertently, or claims rights to a spring that you've always relied upon, you're looking at crop failure. You can practically taste the bitterness of your future cabbage, not from its leaves, but from the resentment that fills your mouth. One quirky tidbit. Some early archaeological sites show evidence of rudimentary irrigation channels dug by hand, leading from natural springs or seasonal rivers. Imagine the arguments that must have erupted over who got how much water from these shared, precious conduits, especially during a drought. Historians still argue whether the concept of individual land ownership emerged primarily from settled agriculture, or if it was a pre-existing social construct adapted to farming needs. Whatever its origins, you're experiencing its painful birthing pangs right now. The establishment of fixed settlements, the very act of putting down roots, pun absolutely intended, inherently creates these new points of friction. When you're constantly on the move as a hunter-gatherer, disagreements over a foraging patch or a temporary hunting ground are fleeting. You can always move on. But when your entire existence is tied to a specific piece of land, when your future food supply depends on it, disputes become entrenched, personal, and potentially explosive. You're witnessing the dawn of boundary lines, property markers, and the simmering resentments that come with them. This struggle for fertile ground isn't just about agriculture. It's about the very human need for security and belonging played out over a patch of dirt and the promise of future cabbage. The simple digging stick, a tool of creation, could also, in a pinch, become an instrument of persuasion. You're holding one now, its smooth, worn surface fitting comfortably in your calloused palm. It's a marvel of Neolithic engineering, allowing you to break ground, loosen soil, and create the small furrows necessary for your precious seeds. But in a world without formal legal systems or police forces, personal grievances over cabbage plots or water rights often required a more direct approach. Imagine a tense encounter. Your neighbor, the one who keeps nudging the boundary markers, is slowly working their way closer to your prize patch of slightly less bitter brassica. You approach, your digging stick held just a little too firmly. There's no shouting, not yet. Just a pointed silence, perhaps a meaningful glance at the shifted stone, and then a slow, deliberate tap of your digging stick against the ground, right on what you consider your rightful boundary. It's a clear, non-verbal assertion of your claim. The stick, designed to prepare the soil, becomes a silent threat, a blunt instrument of dispute resolution. These were the tools of everyday life, pressed into service for conflict. A sturdy hoe, used for weeding, might be hefted just a little too aggressively when confronted with a trespasser. A sharp flint knife, usually reserved for harvesting tough roots or cutting fibers, could be laid conspicuously nearby during a heated discussion about water allocation. These weren't weapons designed for warfare, not in the sense of grand battles, but they represented the immediate, tangible means of enforcing one's will in a world where might, even if subtle, often made right. This wasn't about violence in the modern sense, but about the unspoken understanding of capabilities. You weren't brandishing a sword, but the implication was clear. This tool, vital for your survival, could also be used to defend it. It's a primitive form of deterrence, born from necessity. The casual way someone might lean on their tool, or the careful placement of it when discussing a grievance, would convey far more than words. It's a silent, almost theatrical performance of strength and determination. One quirky tidbit. Some early agricultural communities might have used specific types of polished stone axes, not just for cutting down trees, but as symbols of authority or ownership over certain forested areas, leading to arguments over who had the right to clear specific plots for expansion. Imagine a community leader settling a dispute by solemnly holding up a particularly impressive axe. Historians still argue whether the development of more specialized tools for warfare directly followed the advent of agriculture and settled life, or if these implements evolved from multi-purpose tools like the digging stick. For you, the digging stick is simply a part of your daily life, versatile in its uses, both for growth and for the very subtle prevention of others hindering that growth. The tension in these early agrarian communities wasn't about grand ideologies, but about the fundamental struggle for resources. Every tool, every innovation brought with it new opportunities for production, but also new points of friction. The very act of cultivating the land, of transforming the wild into the controlled, necessitated the development of social mechanisms, however rudimentary, for managing these inevitable conflicts. And sometimes, those mechanisms involve nothing more than a well-placed digging stick and a determined stare, guarding your patch of burgeoning cabbage. The sun begins its slow descent, casting long shadows across your small, agrarian world. The tension over the boundaries and the subtle shifts in marker stones has been building all day. But a digging stick can only do so much. The growing complexity of your settled life, with its shared resources and overlapping claims, demands something more. This is the quiet birth of early legal systems, not written on scrolls or debated in forums, but hammered out through necessity and lived experience. Imagine the community gathering, not in a grand hall, but simply around a central hearth, or beneath a particularly ancient, sprawling tree. The air is thick with the smell of wood smoke and the unspoken anxieties of the day. You've brought your grievance about the encroaching neighbor, and perhaps another family is concerned about the allocation of water from the communal spring, crucial for their increasingly demanding cabbage patches. There's no judge, no jury, no codified laws. Instead, there are the elders, men and women whose wisdom is recognized, whose memories stretch back furthest, and whose opinions carry the most weight. These aren't formal court proceedings. They are more like mediated discussions, guided by established customs and the shared desire for community harmony. An elder might listen patiently as you recount how your neighbor moved the marker stone, then turn to the accused to hear their side. There's a quiet negotiation, perhaps a collective memory recalled. Remember when your grandfather cleared that patch? It was always understood to be for the collective grain, not individual cultivation. Or perhaps the water from that spring has always been shared equally among the families closest to it. The goal isn't punishment, but resolution. The focus is on finding a way to restore balance, to prevent further conflict, and to ensure the survival of the collective. Perhaps a new marker stone is placed, with everyone witnessing its position. Maybe a rotation system for water use is agreed upon, ensuring everyone gets their fair share, even if it means some individual sacrifice. These decisions, while seemingly small, are monumental. They are the first attempts to move beyond personal assertion and towards a shared understanding of rights and responsibilities. One quirky tidbit about this era: some early legal rulings might have been symbolically reinforced by communal meals, where the act of sharing food after a dispute signified the restoration of harmony and agreement. Imagine sealing a land deal over a steaming bowl of ancient stew, perhaps with a few slightly improved cabbage leaves thrown in. Historians still argue whether the earliest forms of social organization and conflict resolution were inherently hierarchical, or if they emerged from more egalitarian, consensus-based systems. For you, it's a matter of practicality. How do we stop fighting over the best cabbage plots and ensure everyone gets enough to eat? These informal agreements, repeated and refined over generations, slowly solidify into accepted norms. This is how we do things here. These customs become the foundation for a shared understanding of justice. The very idea that a community can collectively decide on principles of fairness, that disputes can be settled through discussion rather than force, is a profound leap. You're witnessing the slow, painstaking birth of the rule of law, forged not by grand pronouncements, but by the nagging need to manage the daily squabbles that arise when a group of people decide to put down roots and dedicate their lives to cultivating crops, especially demanding ones, like those ever-improving cabbages. The sun is now dipping below the horizon, casting the Neolithic village in soft, fading light. The day's labors are winding down, but the discussions about land and water, about shared resources and individual claims, often continue into the evening. You're settling down by the fire, listening to the murmurs of your community, and perhaps contributing your own observations to the ongoing informal court of the elders. These elders, often the oldest and most experienced members of the community, don't hold their position through elected office or inherited title in the way you might understand it. Their authority is derived from respect, from their deep knowledge of the land, the weather, and the intricate web of kinship and custom that binds your people together. They've seen more seasons, weathered more droughts, and survived more lean harvests than anyone else. When a dispute arises, say, over whose ancestors first cleared a particular patch of land, or the fairest way to distribute the yield from a surprisingly successful communal cabbage plot, it is to these elders that the community turns. Imagine the scene. An elder, their face lined with the wisdom of years, slowly stirring the embers of the fire. They listen to the aggrieved party, perhaps your family, recounting the trespass onto your carefully cultivated patch of brassica. Then they listen to the other side, patiently, without interruption. There's no dramatic cross-examination, no legal jargon. Instead, there's a quiet understanding of the interconnectedness of everything. A dispute over a few cabbage plants isn't just about the plants. It's about community harmony, about ensuring everyone has enough to survive, and about preventing resentment from festering into outright conflict. Their judgment isn't a decree, but a consensus, often guided by practical solutions. Perhaps they recall a similar situation from generations past and how it was resolved. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen your great-grandmother swore by? You might hear someone whisper, reminding you of a long-held tradition. And then the elder might draw a parallel, connecting that ancient wisdom to the current problem. They might propose a temporary shared use of the contested land, or suggest a new way to share water that benefits both parties without one suffering unduly. The emphasis is on restorative justice, on making things right so the community can continue to function as a cohesive unit. One quirky tidbit about these early councils. Some archaeological findings suggest that certain communities might have used specific stones or shells as tokens during these discussions, passed from speaker to speaker to ensure everyone had their turn to speak without interruption. Imagine the solemnity of holding a worn pebble as you present your case for that prime cabbage growing spot. Historians still argue whether the transition from informal elder councils to more structured chieftainships or nascent legal codes was driven primarily by increasing population density or by the growing complexity of agricultural economies. For you, the elder council is simply the place where problems get solved, where the very tangible issues of survival are navigated with the collected wisdom of your forebears. These meetings are the bedrock of your social order. They are where the unwritten laws are reinforced, where precedents are set, and where the delicate balance between individual needs and communal well-being is maintained. Without these quiet, often lengthy discussions, the fragile experiment of settled agriculture, with all its inherent conflicts, would likely collapse. The success of your increasingly bountiful, if still slightly bitter, cabbage crops relies not just on your labor in the soil, but on the wisdom of your elders around the flickering fire. You wake not to the blare of an alarm, but to the soft glow of pre-dawn light filtering into your simple dwelling. You're living in a time that archaeologists call the pre-pottery Neolithic, a fascinating period when humans were settling down and farming, but hadn't yet figured out how to make durable clay pots. Imagine a world where all your food storage is in woven baskets, leather pouches, or carved wooden vessels. This detail, seemingly minor, profoundly impacted how early farmers lived, worked, and yes, even argued over their nascent cabbage crops. Without pottery, storing surplus food was a monumental challenge. Grains could be kept in pits, lined with clay, or hides. But perishable items, like those slightly improved wild cabbage leaves, were much harder to preserve. You couldn't just toss them into a ceramic jar and expect them to last. This meant your life was even more intensely focused on immediate consumption and rapid processing. You'd harvest your leafy greens, and they'd need to be eaten quickly, perhaps dried, or fermented in some rudimentary fashion to extend their shelf life for a few days. This urgency over fresh produce added another layer of potential friction to communal life. Consider a bountiful harvest of these early brassica plants. Without effective storage, the question immediately becomes, who gets what and how quickly? If one family's plot yields in abundance, but another's has struggled, the pressure to share or to justify keeping your bounty is immense. There's no easy way to hoard, no long-term pantry to fill. Every successful harvest means immediate consumption and potentially immediate distribution. This constant, direct interaction with perishable goods fostered a unique set of challenges and, naturally, arguments. You might hear someone grumble, "My cabbages are wilting." If only we had more hands to process them before they spoil, or a better way to keep them fresh. The absence of pottery also meant simpler cooking methods. Boiling in skin-lined pits heated with hot stones or roasting directly over a fire were common. Preparing your cabbage wouldn't involve a convenient stew pot. It would be a more labor-intensive, often communal effort, further intertwining individual harvests with collective activity. This interdependence could be a source of strength, but also a fertile ground for disputes. Who tended the fire for the communal boiling pit? Whose job was it to gather the hot stones? These seemingly small tasks could ignite tensions, especially when the day was long and the hunger was real. One quirky tidbit from this era. Some theories suggest that early cooking in basketry might have involved dropping superheated stones into water-filled, tightly woven containers to bring the water to a boil, proving that ingenuity thrives even without conventional tools. Imagine a squabble over whose turn it was to retrieve the scalding hot stones for the communal cabbage soup. Historians still argue whether the invention of pottery was primarily driven by the need for better food storage, advancements in cooking technology, or simply as an artistic and cultural expression of settled communities. Whatever the reason, you're navigating a world where every meal, especially one involving a perishable vegetable, comes with its own unique set of logistical and social challenges, constantly pushing your community to adapt and, yes, sometimes argue. The rhythmic scraping of your stone hoe against the earth is no longer a solitary sound. It's joined by the efforts of your kin, your neighbors, perhaps even families from allied groups. Your community has grown, and with it, the scale of your agricultural endeavors. This is the rise of communal farming, where individual plots, while still present, are often supplemented by larger, shared fields. This collective effort brings incredible efficiency and a greater chance of survival. But it also introduces a whole new set of complex social dynamics and, inevitably, more arguments, even over something as unassuming as cabbage. Imagine a vast open field, larger than any single family could manage alone. Here, everyone works together, clearing, planting, weeding, and harvesting. You're elbow to elbow with your fellow villagers, sweating under the same sun. This shared labor fosters a strong sense of collective identity and purpose. It also allows for larger yields, ensuring that the community as a whole has enough to eat, even if some individual plots struggle. This shared risk and shared reward system is a hallmark of early settled life. But what happens when one family consistently puts in less effort? Or when one person claims a prime spot in the communal field for their own brassica experiments, hoping to cultivate an even milder strain, and then expects the communal labor to tend it? You're no longer just arguing with your immediate neighbor over a shifted marker stone. You're dealing with the intricate politics of a larger group. The unspoken glances, the pointed sighs, and the subtle gestures of disapproval become the language of dissent. Consider the harvest of the communal cabbage. This isn't just about your personal patch anymore. It's about the collective bounty. Who gets how much? Is it based on the number of hands in each household, on their need, on their contribution to the labor? These are the fundamental questions of early economics and social justice, played out in the context of root vegetables. You can almost hear the low murmurs. They took more than their share last season. Or, their family contributed less to the weeding of the communal brassica patch, yet they're loading up their baskets now. One quirky tidbit. Some anthropologists suggest that communal feasting, where large quantities of food were prepared and shared, served not just as celebrations, but as a crucial mechanism for redistributing surplus and reinforcing social cohesion, effectively defusing potential arguments over unequal harvests. Imagine a tense silence broken by the promise of a big communal cabbage and grain stew, designed to soothe frayed nerves. Historians still argue whether the development of communal farming was a direct response to the demands of specific crop types requiring large-scale labor, or if it evolved from pre-existing egalitarian social structures of hunter-gatherer groups. Whatever the primary driver, your life is now deeply intertwined with the successes and failures and the squabbles of your entire community. The path to civilization, it seems, is paved with collective sweat and the occasional argument over leafy greens. As the communal farming efforts expand, so too does the complexity of your daily life. The produce from those shared fields, particularly the increasingly reliable yields of your evolving brassica varieties, now finds its way into the communal pot. This isn't just a figure of speech. It's a literal boiling pit, perhaps a large hide-lined basin filled with water and heated with hot stones, where the collective harvest is prepared. This shared meal, while a powerful symbol of unity, also becomes an unexpected focal point for arguments about distribution and fairness. Imagine the steam rising from the communal pot, carrying the faint, earthy aroma of boiling cabbage and grains. Everyone gathers, anticipation a tangible thing. But then the ladle comes out, and the subtle calculations begin. You watch as the elder responsible for serving portions fills a wooden bowl. Is that family getting a slightly larger scoop because they have more children? Or because their strongest adult spent more time weeding the communal patch? Is your own portion adequate, given the hours you put in? These aren't just thoughts. They are the genesis of whispered complaints and simmering resentment. The very concept of a fair share is intensely personal and open to interpretation. One person might believe it should be based on the number of mouths to feed, regardless of individual contribution. Another might argue that effort should be directly rewarded, so those who worked harder on the communal cabbage fields deserve more. Then there's the issue of quality. Are all the cabbage leaves equally tender, or did someone get the tougher, more fibrous outer leaves, while another received the plump inner ones? You can bet this leads to hushed debates, often ending in a frustrated sigh or a pointed stare across the fire. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen your great-grandmother swore by? You might mutter under your breath, using an old saying to express a general sense of things being out of balance, not quite right. These debates, while seemingly petty, are crucial. They force your community to develop social norms and unwritten rules around resource allocation. Do you share equally or equitably? Do you prioritize the weak and infirm, or reward the strong and productive? These are the foundational questions of any economy, and you're living them, one shared bowl of cabbage stew at a time. The successful integration of increasingly domesticated plants like cabbage into the communal diet wasn't just a matter of cultivation, it was a matter of social engineering. One quirky tidbit: some archaeological sites indicate that early communal eating spaces sometimes featured larger, more decorative serving vessels for the collective meal, perhaps as a way to emphasize the shared nature of the food and visually reinforce community bonds, even as arguments simmered. Imagine a particularly ornate wooden bowl for the communal cabbage, meant to distract from the uneven portions. Historians still argue whether the development of more complex social hierarchies in early agricultural societies was a direct result of food surplus and the need to manage it, or if pre-existing leadership structures simply adapted to the new demands of settled life. For you, the shared pot is a constant reminder that abundance brings its own set of challenges, and that even the humblest vegetable can spark a lively, albeit quiet, debate. The sun, now at its zenith, casts a harsh light on your community, highlighting not just the thriving crops, but also the lingering tensions. The debates over land, water, and fair shares in the communal pot haven't disappeared, but something remarkable is happening. Your community is finding ways to resolve these cabbage crises. These aren't grand, legislative acts, but ingenious, pragmatic solutions born from the urgent need to survive and thrive together. Imagine a situation where a persistent argument over a shared water source threatens to divide the community. Instead of letting it fester, the elders, perhaps drawing on collective wisdom, propose a rotation system. Each family or each designated plot gets specific hours or days to draw water. It's not perfect, and someone might still grumble about getting the hotter, later hours, but it's a clear, agreed-upon method that ensures everyone eventually gets what they need. This shift from ad hoc arguments to structured, albeit simple, agreements is a monumental step in social evolution. Another common source of friction might be the encroachment on prime growing land. Rather than resorting to silent glares and brandish digging sticks, the community might decide to mark boundaries with more permanent features. Perhaps a line of larger, distinctive stones is laid, or a small ditch is dug to clearly delineate one family's plot from another's, or from the communal field. These aren't just physical barriers. They are visible symbols of consensus, a collective understanding that this land is assigned, and these rules are to be respected. The act of collectively establishing these markers reinforces the agreement, making it harder for individuals to subtly shift them without immediate communal notice. Consider the ongoing grumbles about unequal contributions to the communal brassica patch. Instead of endless arguments, the community might introduce an informal labor tracking system. Perhaps certain families are tasked with specific roles for the season. One family might be responsible for weeding the cabbage, another for protecting it from pests, another for harvesting. While not a precise ledger, it creates a sense of shared responsibility and makes it easier for the elders to see who is truly contributing their fair share. It's a very early form of project management, driven by the desire for delicious, dispute-free vegetables. One quirky tidbit about these early solutions: some archaeologists theorize that the creation of large communal grain storage pits, sometimes requiring collective labor to dig and maintain, served not just a practical function, but also as a powerful symbol of communal cooperation, a shared investment that overshadowed smaller individual squabbles over things like cabbage. Imagine the pride in a massive, well-lined pit filled with the bounty of the land, a testament to what cooperation could achieve. Historians still argue whether the complexity of early agricultural societies necessitated these solutions for conflict resolution, or if these societies developed more sophisticated social structures first, which then allowed for larger-scale agriculture. For you, these are simply the tools, both physical and social, that allow your fragile experiment in settled life to continue, ensuring that the bitter tang of argument doesn't overwhelm the mild, earthy taste of your cultivated cabbage. As you stand overlooking your fields, the sun setting in a blaze of orange and purple, you can't help but reflect on the journey. You've witnessed the slow, painstaking transformation of wild plants into domesticated crops, and the even slower, more complex evolution of human societies adapting to this new way of life. The arguments over cabbage, small and seemingly trivial as they were, offer profound lessons about the enduring nature of human conflict and cooperation. Think about it. The core of those ancient squabbles, the fight over resources, the establishment of boundaries, the quest for fairness in distribution, the need for rules to govern collective action. These aren't just relics of the Neolithic age. These are fundamental human challenges that persist, in various forms, to this very day. Whether it was a dispute over a prime cabbage patch, or a modern nation-state arguing over oil fields, the underlying drive for security and prosperity remains remarkably similar. You might chuckle, remembering the almost comedic image of two early farmers grunting at each other over a moved marker stone, their digging sticks silently asserting their claims. But that primal scene contains the genesis of all property law, all international treaties, and all courtroom dramas. The desire to own, to protect what one has labored for, is deeply ingrained. And the need for a mechanism to resolve disputes, whether it's an elder council under a tree or a Supreme Court, is essential for any society to function. The sheer patience of your ancestors, the slow, multi-generational process of selective breeding that transformed a bitter wild brassica into something edible, is a testament to human perseverance. They weren't scientists, yet they engaged in proto-scientific experimentation, observing, adapting, and passing down knowledge. And in doing so, they inadvertently created the very first forms of agricultural economics, complete with supply and demand, labor costs, and distribution dilemmas. One quirky tidbit to ponder. Some historians suggest that early agricultural arguments sometimes escalated into ritualized competitions or games. where the outcome of a contest determined the resolution of a dispute over land or resources, thus avoiding outright violence. Imagine settling a cabbage dispute with a foot race or a wrestling match. Historians still argue whether the development of complex ethical systems and moral codes in early human societies was primarily a top-down imposition by leaders, or a bottom-up evolution from these practical needs for conflict resolution. For you, the lessons are clear. Even over something as humble as a leafy green vegetable, humans will find reasons to disagree, but also, crucially, reasons to cooperate and build. The quiet, almost invisible struggles over your ancestral cabbage patches were not just about food. They were about defining community, establishing order, and learning how to live together when survival depended on collective effort. These early arguments, seemingly insignificant, were the foundational bricks laid for every complex society that followed. They were the very first rehearsals for civilization, teaching lessons that echo through millennia, even if you never again have to argue over a tough piece of boiled brassica. As the night deepens, drawing a comforting blanket over the ancient world you've just explored, the echoes of those Neolithic arguments over cabbage might seem far away. Yet their lessons resonate remarkably in our own complex, interconnected world. You're looking at a modern grocery store shelf, overflowing with crisp green cabbages, vibrant broccoli, and delicate cauliflowers, all descendants of that humble, wild Brassica oleracea. But the journey from that tough, coastal plant to today's abundant produce was paved with continuous, often frustrating negotiations. Consider the modern farmer. Today, their arguments aren't over a shifted boundary stone, but perhaps over global market prices, international trade agreements, or the ever-present debate about pesticide use versus organic certification. The water wars of the Neolithic era have morphed into conflicts over damming rivers for irrigation, or the environmental impact of large-scale agriculture. The essence of the disputes remains the same. How do we manage shared resources when everyone needs them? And how do we ensure fairness in an increasingly complex system? The discussions around the communal pot have evolved into global supply chain logistics, debates about food waste, and the ethics of food security. Who gets what, how much, and how is it distributed equitably across continents? These are still the fundamental questions. You might hear modern farmers arguing about seed patents, about genetically modified organisms, or about the fair price for their labor, all direct descendants of those initial squabbles over whose seeds were better, or whose family worked harder on the communal plot. Even the ancient elder council finds its reflection in today's institutions. Local zoning boards, agricultural cooperatives, international trade organizations. These are the modern mechanisms designed to resolve disputes, set standards, and manage the vast, interconnected web of food production and distribution. While they might use complex legal frameworks and sophisticated data analysis, their fundamental purpose remains the same: to prevent global cabbage crises from spiraling out of control. One quirky tidbit about modern cabbage: despite its ubiquity, there are still passionate debates among cultivators about the best heirloom varieties versus newer hybrids, mirroring the ancient selective breeding choices. Imagine a modern farmer extolling the virtues of a particular heirloom strain with the same fervor that a Neolithic farmer praised his slightly less bitter brassica from the sunny rock. Historians still argue whether humanity's capacity for cooperation or its propensity for conflict has been the stronger driving force in shaping our agricultural and social evolution. What's clear is that both forces have been inextricably linked since the very first seed was planted. So, as you drift off, remember that even in the quiet of the past, over something as seemingly insignificant as a leafy green, humans were learning the hard, essential lessons of living together, of managing resources, and of building societies. The journey from hunter-gatherer to farmer wasn't just about cultivating plants. It was about cultivating civilization itself, one small, often argued over cabbage at a time. The next time you see a head of cabbage, maybe offer it a silent nod of appreciation. It's carried a weight of history, far heavier than its humble leaves suggest. Now, as the last wisps of our historical journey gently fade, let your mind slow, softening at the edges. The faint hum of the fan, if you have one on, is a steady, soothing rhythm. Feel the quiet settle around you, pushing away the day's lingering thoughts. The echoes of ancient arguments are distant now, melting into the deep stillness of the night. There's nothing more to solve, no more history to recount. Just the gentle expanse of quiet, wrapping itself around you like a soft, familiar blanket. Let your breath deepen, becoming smooth and even. Feel the quiet confidence of knowing you've journeyed far through time and toil, and now it's time to rest. Every thought that drifts in can simply drift out, carried away on a gentle current of peace. Allow yourself to sink deeper into the calm, letting sleep gather you in its soft embrace. End of script. Sweet dreams.